contestants. Well, congratulations, Graeme, on the gold medal. And I've been involved with Graeme over the years, and some of those projects that were up there are quite near and dear. It was good to see them again. The projects are beautiful houses. The cluster housing was incredibly important. I'd love to make, or hear you make the connect between your thinking in those particular houses that we looked at, the idea of space, landscape, connection, and get your thoughts about what you take out of those projects, and what you think about the relevance of those experiences are with respect to the problems that we're having with density, particularly in the first instance, the outer suburbs, where we know land is really wasted, and it's wasted in very, very traditional subdivisions. So the thoughts about how you would see suburban typologies perhaps needing to evolve, and if I could then add to that, how do you influence builders, developers, and even government into thinking about new typologies? Obviously, builders and developers have now made incredible inroads to cheap buildings. They can do McMansions for, the cost of a car. How do you move from the beautiful thoughts that you have been going through on your houses to the problems of the outer suburbs?
How long do we have, Peter? Okay. I suppose a lot of that work that we had done earlier on with merchant builders were in fact a reaction. They were both a positive reaction, though, and they were a thinking reaction. It was about the time we had also produced a book, John Patterson, David Jenkin, myself, called A Mansion and No House, which really fathomed the problems associated with planning regulations, building regulations, and land usage, and looked at infrastructure as a way, or how one might refine infrastructure and make it a little more plausible. And density became one of the tools by which one could look at lower cost housing, because, as you say, buildings one can, with mass production, reduce the cost. Land is the thing that has gone up exponentially to the point where it's the bit that people can't afford. If people could afford the land, they could actually put a tent on it and be quite happy, I think. But you just can't get the land these days. So, then to your question about what happens with the greenfields, I'd like to say that is probably finished, and whilst there is a legacy there, and there are developers that own land, and that might well be explored, I do think we've got to get into the middle suburbs and in some of the inner suburbs and have more effective housing. Now that means to me that you've got to have the houses of a degree of livability. I mean, people always talk about the quarter-acre lot as being their aspiration. But in fact, there has been, with the Granville report recently, a recognition that of all things, in the end, it didn't matter if people lived in apartments. It had to do with what they most wanted was proximity to facilities in the city and the centres of activity. So then there was the point made about the fact that most of the buildings in those areas are being done by project builders, and they've so refined their techniques and their technologies and their building methods and their methods of payment, and their persuasiveness to actually buy materials cheaper is phenomenal. You can't compete. You can get down to $1,200 a metre for houses of that ilk, even less, whereas an architect's house was probably costing $2,500 up to $5,000, and depending who's paying, much more. However, I'm talking here about a rational attempt at producing housing for a greater group of people. And to do that, I think there's another problem that comes out of that, and that's the way in which we have inserted buildings into the suburbs, and particularly inner suburbs, in the last 20 years hasn't helped. And that's why we've had such a backlash. There hasn't been the concern that we ought to have had with landscaping and the way in which buildings can fit within an existing context which is attractive. Those things should be paramount, that one has a sensitivity and a sense of respect for those things that are beautiful, so one doesn't have to destroy them just to increase density. It's a manageable thing, but it does, I think, with Jeffrey's new group coming up, or groups, and the fact that we have a Premier who's now very interested, I would have thought that exemplars now should be produced to indicate that there are other ways of doing things successfully as models.
I was going to move on and say it feels as if the sort of way you presented today, this unravelling of sort of life and where you've been, where you've come from, where you've been, privileges that idea that quality of space is as important as density, and it sort of feels a little bit like we talk about density and use terms that somehow edit out the idea of quality. And it seems very much that what you're interested in is a quality of a type that's about a quality of space that might be collective rather than exclusive. What do you think collectivity is something you're interested in? Is it sort of...
I am. I mean, I agree with you that there is that other potential, that the actual amalgam of spaces and the joint ownership of spaces is a significant condition in all of this. But you can also say that if you had just a common road, which was a shared space, which could take slow vehicles and can be used for play, and that was limited, as distinct from the things that I showed on Winter Park, where you did have actually recreation space of a significant area and very heavily landscaped. One of the legacies or one of the problems associated with introducing that is that everybody's not happy with working together with other people, and particularly not initially. It takes a while for people to get to own the space and to share a space. I think that is a problem. But it's not insurmountable, because you can do it where you can have your private space and your shared space and have that function in that way. No different from how you'd be interacting with neighbours down the street frontage.
That's right, and in some ways the model that we seem to have emerged out of is a sort of much more privatised sense of needing to have a house on a block that stretches to the limits of the block, but perhaps which is a sort of metric and comes out of house prices and in housing as a form of investment. But maybe the quality of space between things and collective space is also very critical.
It is totally critical. I mean, there is a bit of a thrust in all of this to say, how do we, as I said before, reduce land costs? You reduce land costs by reducing the building allotment. But what one forgets is that you might be doing that, but at the same time the houses tend to be getting a bit larger. And there is this other phenomena out of all of that, is that the houses get close together, and that's the condition that needs really intensive design to resolve that amalgamation, that fit. Because the closer buildings get, the harder it is to get them to be sympathetically aligned. And that's where, character and cohesiveness and grouping of buildings which have a sufficient diversity in their own form and their design, but still have a cohesiveness about them, so that they do gel and they become sympathetically imaged, if you like. But there is another issue with Australians, I think. We might talk about the extended family and the fact that families want to be together. Well, probably they don't much in Australia. You want to get as far away as possible from your parents. And there's probably not one person out there who hasn't attempted to do that. Except one up there who lives with us, and she's hanging in.
Graeme, let's get real dense. Let's talk about tall towers, apartment living. Not medium rise, not your 6 stories, but seriously tall buildings. This city has changed in the last 15 years. We're now seeing a lot of tall residential buildings in the city, around the city. There's a lot of people that opt for it, but it's still a very much misaligned housing typology. It's like, oh, you know, tall buildings are the slums of the future sort of thing. What's your feeling? How do you take the qualities that you seek in those beautiful houses, and how do you translate that in your mind to a different typology, a high density, high rise typology?
Well, I think that there are many options available for us to densify our cities and to make things work. It's how you do it that's important, and the tall building is a little like that other piece of anatomical organ, of which it is said it's not the size that matters, it's the way its functional capability. And I think the same applies. It's not how tall a thing is, but how it's designed and how it relates to the city. I mean, some of the most significant and important buildings in history have always been the pinnacle building and the iconic, to use that word, which I ought not to word, is that they have become a bit emblematic, but then they were a function, or they were a result of a significant function within the town. But I don't see that high-rise buildings per se are bad at all. I just think they are a significant option. It's just how they're done. And what do they include in terms of social amenity? One of the arguments is against it. It removes people from the ground where we want people working and living on the streets. Well, I guess that's not going to happen over 6 stories anyway, so it doesn't matter whether you're travelling 6 or 26 stories to me. And there are those other aspects of another kind of lifestyle up in the heavens that you don't get at the ground level. So again, I think it's the quality of the design, but also the social factors that one can engender in any built form if one thinks about it and doesn't optimise it. I mean, that's the other thing, that developers generally tend to maximise the development at the expense of livability. And the long-term benefits, though, if you had something that was good and desirable today, and it would be in 50 years' time, its cost-benefit condition is that's just so much better than doing something that maximises initially and gets the developer his best return at the time. We have to be a little more socially aware and a little more economically conscious, I think, to get these things working. So go for it.
We are.
I was going to sort of take a slightly different tack for a minute and just say that it seems to me that some of what you've done, and in fact a broad stream of what you've done, particularly with some of the merchant collaborations, have reflected to me, and it may be a personal view, of a sort of really good example of how an architect has met his public, in the sense, not literally, but that you have got to grips with that idea of how we might participate on a greater level with architecture for ordinariness, which then keys in with other things that you've done, which are this sort of bigger role of architecture. And it definitely seems to have characterised your career. Do you have a sort of position on it? Has it been deliberate or haphazard, the way you've taken those?
Oh, definitely the latter. Haphazard. Mixed up, confused.
Yeah.
But as I implied tonight, there was something, when going back over all of this, my